sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. A man's unwavering prayer in his final moments made the impossible happen. As the execution chamber's lights flickered to life, Kaziah Everwind spoke his last words. But what happened next shook the foundations of Stormhaven Prison itself. When science and logic fail, can pure faith manifest the divine? What would you do if you were strapped to the electric chair, knowing you were innocent, with only minutes left to live? Before we dive into this extraordinary story of faith, justice, and divine intervention, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. You won't want to miss our weekly stories of miracles that defy explanation. Now let's begin. The coastal town of Shadowvale Ridge cast long shadows across its weathered streets, where the constant rhythm of crashing waves against rugged cliffs created nature's own heartbeat. Here, among the salt-sprayed buildings and fog-shrouded mornings, lived a man whose faith would soon be tested beyond imagination. Kaziah Everwind wasn't what most people would picture when they thought of a deeply spiritual man. With his weathered hands and quiet demeanor, he spent his days working as a master carpenter, crafting intricate wooden pieces that seemed to capture light and shadow in ways that defied explanation. But beneath his humble exterior lay a soul whose connection to the divine ran deeper than the very foundations of Shadowvale Ridge itself. Every morning, before the sun painted the horizon in watercolor hues, Kaz would climb to the highest point of the coastal cliffs. There, as fog banks rolled in from the sea like silent guardians, he would kneel in prayer, his words carried away by the wind. The townspeople had grown used to seeing his silhouette against the dawn sky, a solitary figure whose devotion seemed as constant as the tides themselves. Prayer isn't just words, he would often say to his sister Acacia, who worried about his daily pilgrimages to the dangerous cliffs. It's a conversation with something greater than ourselves. Every sunrise is a reminder that light always follows darkness. Kaz lived with his aging mother, Vesper, in a modest house he had largely built himself. The home was filled with the scent of cedar and pine, testament to his craft, and the walls were adorned with intricate wooden sculptures that seemed to tell stories of their own. Vesper, frail but sharp-minded, would often sit in her favorite chair by the window, watching her son work in his workshop, her fingers moving silently over her prayer beads. The Everwinds weren't wealthy by any measure, but their home had become a sanctuary for those in need. Kaz never turned away anyone seeking help, whether they needed repairs to their homes or simply a warm meal and a listening ear. His best friend, Cyrus Winterborn, often joked that Kaz would give away his last piece of bread if someone needed it more. "You can't save everyone, Kaz," Cyrus would say, watching his friend work late into the night on yet another project for a struggling neighbor. "Maybe not," Kaz would reply, his hands steady as they shaped the wood. "But we're called to try. Every act of kindness is a prayer in its own right." What no one knew was that these acts of kindness would soon become the very thing that would seal his fate. In a cruel twist of irony, it was Kaz's habit of helping strangers that would place him at the center of a nightmare no one could have foreseen. The morning everything changed began like any other. Kaz had finished his prayers on the cliff and was walking back through town when he heard the sirens. Police cars screamed past him, their lights painting the fog red and blue. He thought nothing of it at first. Such things were rare in Shadowvale Ridge, but not unheard of. It wasn't until he reached his workshop that Detective Atlas Steele was waiting for him, flanked by 2 officers. The detective's face was grim, his badge catching the morning light like a warning beacon. "Kaziah Everwind," Steele's voice cut through the salt air like a blade. "You're under arrest for the murder of Regina Vale." The name meant nothing to Kaz, but the charges hit him like a physical blow. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he could see his mother watching from the window, her prayer beads clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "There must be some mistake," Kaz said calmly, even as his world began to crumble around him. "I don't know any Regina Vale." But Detective Steele's next words would haunt him for months to come. "She was found last night in your workshop, Mr. Everwind, and your tools were the murder weapons." As they led him away, Kaz could hear his mother's prayers following him down the street, carried on the same winds that had so often carried his own. But for the first time in his life, he wondered if anyone was listening. Little did Kaz know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would test not only his faith, but the very boundaries between the natural and supernatural. As the gates of Stormhaven maximum security prison loomed before him, he couldn't have known that his greatest trial, and most extraordinary miracle, still lay ahead. The iron gates of Stormhaven maximum security prison groaned shut behind Kaziah Everwind, like the jaws of some ancient beast. Built into the very cliffs that had once been his sanctuary, the prison rose like a Gothic cathedral of punishment, its stone walls stained dark by decades of salt spray and storm. Detective Atlas Steele led Kaz through a series of security checkpoints, each more oppressive than the last. The detective's face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt perhaps, whenever he looked at his prisoner. Kaz noticed, but remained silent, his lips moving in quiet prayer. "Save your prayers," Steele finally said, as they reached the processing area. "You'll need more than divine intervention for what's coming." The evidence against Kaz seemed insurmountable. Regina Vale, a stranger to Shadowvale Ridge, had been found murdered in his workshop, her blood soaking into the sawdust that covered the floor. The murder weapons, his own carefully maintained tools, lay scattered around her body. Security footage showed her entering his workshop late at night but never leaving. Most damning of all, her blood was found on the clothes in his hamper, though Kaz had no memory of ever meeting her. The trial was swift and merciless. Prosecutor Theron Blackthorne painted a picture of Kaz as a wolf in sheep's clothing, using his reputation for kindness to lure vulnerable victims. "Look at how perfectly crafted his facade is," Blackthorne told the jury, his voice dripping with contempt. "The daily prayers, the charitable works, all a carefully constructed alibi for a calculating killer." Kaz's court-appointed attorney, Meridian Cross, fought valiantly, but seemed overwhelmed by the prosecution's evidence. Even character witnesses, including Cyrus Winterbourne and dozens of townspeople Kaz had helped over the years, couldn't overcome the physical evidence stacked against him. When Judge Altair Galanis delivered the verdict, his voice echoed through the courthouse like thunder. "Kaziah Everwind, this court finds you guilty of first-degree murder. The brutality of your crime, coupled with the calculated way you used your reputation to commit it, leaves me no choice but to sentence you to death by electric chair." The words fell like physical blows, but Kaz's expression never changed. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, your will be done." His first night in Stormhaven was a study in controlled chaos. The processing officer, a burly man with dead eyes, stripped him of his identity piece by piece. His clothes, his carpenter's calloused hands cleaned and fingerprinted. His faith reduced to a single notation on a form. Religious preference? Christian. But it was Officer Raventhorn Aldrich who would become Kaz's primary guard, and unwitting witness to what was to come. Aldrich was known for his strict professionalism and emotional detachment, yet something about Kaz's quiet dignity gave him pause. "Cell Block D," Aldrich announced, leading Kaz down a corridor that seemed to descend into the bowels of the earth. "Death Row, your new home." The cell was barely 6 by 8 feet, with walls that wept moisture from the nearby ocean. A thin mattress, a steel toilet, and a small desk bolted to the wall comprised all the furnishings. But it was the window, a narrow slit carved through 3 feet of stone, that drew Kaz's attention. Through it, he could just make out a sliver of the same sky he had prayed under every morning of his free life. "You know what's strange?" Aldrich said suddenly, pausing before locking the cell. "I've been doing this job 15 years, seen all kinds of men face death, but you're the first one who seems at peace with it." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kaz turned from the window, meeting the guard's eyes. "Peace isn't the absence of trouble, Officer Aldrich. It's the presence of God in the midst of trouble." That night, as the sounds of Death Row echoed through the ancient corridors, men crying, men raging, men bargaining with a God they'd ignored until now, Kaz knelt on the concrete floor of his cell. The position was uncomfortable, the floor cold and damp, but he remained there for hours, praying not for himself, but for the family of Regina Vale, for the justice system that had failed them both, and even for the real killer who had left him to face death in their place. Aldrich, passing on his rounds, found himself slowing each time he passed cell 342. The sight of the condemned man praying stirred something long dormant in his cynical heart. He had seen many men find religion in prison, but this was different. This man's faith wasn't born of desperation. It was as natural as breathing. Father Sylvestris Drake, the prison chaplain, became a regular visitor to Kaz's cell. The elderly priest, who had counseled countless condemned men, found himself more often sitting in silence learning from Kaz's unwavering faith, rather than offering spiritual guidance. "How can you maintain such faith?" Drake asked one day, after watching Kaz spend an hour in silent prayer. Many would curse God for allowing this injustice. Kaz's response was simple. "Faith isn't a fair-weather friend, Father. It's easy to believe when life is good. The real test comes when everything is stripped away, and all you have left is your trust in God's plan." As weeks turned into months, something strange began to happen in Cell Block D. Other inmates, hardened men facing their own dates with death, would fall silent when Kaz prayed. Some began requesting to speak with him, seeking not escape from their fate, but peace in facing it. Director Callias Droverson, the prison warden, watched these developments with growing unease. In his 2 decades running Stormhaven, he had never seen a condemned man have such an effect on the prison population. It was, he decided, dangerous. Hope was a commodity too volatile for death row. But as Kaz's execution date approached, no one could have predicted how that hope, that unshakable faith, would manifest itself in ways that would shake Stormhaven Prison to its very foundations. As autumn storms battered the cliffs of Shadowvale Ridge, Stormhaven Prison stood like a dark monolith against the turbulent sky. Inside Cell Block D, the approaching execution date of Kaziah Everwind had created an atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken possibilities. But while most condemned men grew more desperate as their time grew shorter, Kaz seemed to radiate an increasingly powerful sense of peace. Officer Raven Thorne Aldrich couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was unfolding before his eyes. During his night shifts, he would often find Kaz awake, kneeling in prayer, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light filtering through the narrow window. What struck Aldrich most wasn't the prayer itself, many inmates prayed, but the way the very air seemed to change during these moments, as if the cold stone walls of Stormhaven were holding their breath. One particularly stormy night, Aldrich found himself drawn into conversation with his unusual prisoner. "You know what bothers me, Everwind?" Aldrich said, his keys jingling softly as he paused by the cell. "I've seen men face death before. They all break eventually. But you're different. It's like you know something the rest of us don't." Kaz opened his eyes, his face serene despite the shadows under his eyes. "Perhaps what I know is simply what I've always known, Officer Aldrich. That truth, like light, has a way of finding even the smallest cracks to shine through." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Truth? The evidence against you was overwhelming." "Evidence can tell a story," Kaz replied, rising slowly from his prayer position. "But not always the true story. Just as these prison walls can contain a man's body, but not his spirit." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Cassian Vale, the prison physician, coming to perform one of the mandatory pre-execution health checks, a irony that never ceased to disturb both doctor and condemned alike. Dr. Vale, a tall, austere man with prematurely gray hair, had developed a peculiar fascination with Kaz. As he checked vital signs and made his notes, he would often engage in philosophical discussions that left him more unsettled than when he arrived. "Your heart rate is remarkably steady," Dr. Vale noted, frowning at his instruments. "Most men in your position show significant physiological stress by this point." Kaz smiled gently. "The heart knows what the mind sometimes struggles to accept, Doctor. When you're innocent, fear gives way to something else, a certainty that truth cannot remain buried forever." These words would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. That very night, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Shadowvale Ridge, Lysander Voss sat at his kitchen table, hands trembling as he stared at an envelope containing evidence that could change everything. Voss, a night security guard at a nearby construction site, had been harboring a secret that had grown too heavy to bear. He had seen something the night Regina Vale was murdered, something that had been eating away at his conscience ever since Kaziah Everwind's conviction. Meanwhile, back at Stormhaven, Father Sylvestris Drake was conducting his evening rounds when he noticed something unusual. The normally raucous death row had fallen silent except for the sound of multiple voices joining in prayer. Following the sound, he discovered that inmates in several cells were praying along with Kaz, their voices creating an otherworldly harmony that echoed through the corridor. Director Callius Droverson was less impressed by these developments. Standing in his office, watching the security feeds, he saw not a miracle in the making, but a potential security risk. "This has gone far enough," he announced to his assembled staff. "One man's delusions are infecting the entire block. I want the execution date moved up." But even as Droverson spoke these words, events were being set in motion that no one could have anticipated. In his small apartment, Lysander Voss finally made the decision that would change everything. With shaking hands, he picked up his phone and dialed Detective Atlas Steele's number. "Detective," Voss said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something about the night Regina Vale died. Something I should have told you months ago." Steele, who had never been entirely comfortable with the speed of Kaz's conviction, felt his pulse quicken. "I'm listening." Back in cell block D, Kaz was experiencing something that even his profound faith hadn't prepared him for. As he knelt in his nightly prayer, the air in his cell seemed to thicken, and a soft, barely perceptible light began to emanate from the corners of the room. At first, he thought it was his eyes playing tricks on him, but then he felt it, a presence so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. Officer Aldrich, making his rounds, stopped dead in his tracks when he reached cell 342. Later, he would struggle to describe what he saw, a kind of luminescence that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and Kaz kneeling in the midst of it, his face transformed by an expression of pure joy. "I've been waiting for you, Lord," Kaz whispered, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "I knew you wouldn't abandon your servant." The light grew stronger, and for a brief moment Aldrich could have sworn he heard something like distant music, not from any earthly instrument, but a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the prison. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the light faded, leaving behind only a lingering sense of wonder and the unshakable feeling that something momentous was about to unfold. The morning after the mysterious light appeared in Kaz's cell, Stormhaven Prison hummed with an energy that even the most hardened guards couldn't ignore. Officer Raven Thorne Aldrich had spent the remainder of his shift in a state of quiet shock, his worldview fundamentally shaken by what he'd witnessed. When he finally worked up the courage to report the incident to Director Droverson, the warden's reaction was predictably dismissive. "Light effects from the storm," Droverson said flatly, not looking up from his paperwork. "Or perhaps fatigue from working too many night shifts. We don't deal in miracles here, Officer Aldrich. We deal in concrete walls and steel bars." But Aldrich couldn't shake what he'd seen. "Sir, with all due respect, I've worked these halls for 12 years. I know the difference between stormlight and whatever this was, and I wasn't the only one who saw it. Indeed, inmates across death row were talking about the strange glow that had seemed to pulse through the entire block, and how their dreams that night had been filled with an inexplicable sense of peace. Even the most hardened criminals found themselves speaking in hushed, reverent tones. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Atlas Steele was facing his own crisis of conscience as he sat across from Lysander Voss in an all-night diner. The security guard's hands trembled as he pushed a manila envelope across the table. "I should have come forward sooner," Voss said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I was scared. You have to understand, what I saw that night, it wasn't just about the murder. It was about power, corruption, things bigger than all of us. Steele opened the envelope and his face grew increasingly grave as he examined its contents. Security footage, timestamps, photographs, evidence that painted a very different picture of the night Regina Vale died. But what troubled him most was the signature at the bottom of several documents. Someone very high up in Shadowvale's power structure had orchestrated this entire tragedy. "Why Everwind?" Steele asked, looking up from the damning evidence. "Why pin it on him?" Voss's laugh was hollow. "Because who better to destroy than a man everyone believes is a saint? Break people's faith in goodness, and you can make them believe anything." Back at Stormhaven, Father Sylvestris Drake sat in Kaz's cell, listening as the condemned man described the visitation he'd experienced. The elderly chaplain had counseled countless prisoners, heard innumerable tales of religious experiences, but something about Kaz's quiet certainty made his skin prickle. "It wasn't just light, Father," Kaz explained, his eyes distant with memory. "It was presence, like standing in the heart of truth itself. And I understood something in that moment, that what's happening here is bigger than my case, bigger than my life or death. It's about showing people that faith isn't just words we say, but a force that can shake the foundations of everything we think we know." Dr. Cassian Vale, who had come to perform another pre-execution check, lingered outside the cell, listening. As a man of science, he had always dismissed religious experiences as manifestations of psychological stress. But he couldn't explain the readings he'd been getting from Kaz. Heart rate, blood pressure, brain activity, all suggested a person in a state of profound peace rather than someone facing imminent death. "Your readings are impossible," Vale muttered, shaking his head as he checked his instruments again. "No one facing execution maintains such physiological stability. It defies everything we know about human stress response." Kaz smiled gently. "Perhaps, Doctor, it's time to consider that there are things in this world that can't be measured by your instruments." The day progressed, with an almost electric tension building in the air. Detective Steele, after reviewing all of Voss's evidence, began making calls to trusted contacts in the justice system. But he quickly discovered that powerful forces were already moving to block any attempt at reopening the case. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," one contact warned him before hanging up. "Some doors are better left closed." But Steele couldn't let it go. The detective, who had once been convinced of Kaz's guilt, now found himself racing against time to expose the truth. He knew, however, that the wheels of justice turned slowly, possibly too slowly to save an innocent man. As evening approached, Director Droverson received a call that made him pale visibly. After hanging up, he immediately summoned his senior staff. "The execution is being moved up," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "Tomorrow at midnight. No delays, no exceptions." Officer Aldrich, present for the announcement, felt his heart sink. "Sir, that's against protocol. There are procedures, waiting periods." "The decision comes from above," Droverson cut him off. "I suggest you all focus on your duties rather than questioning authority." Word of the accelerated execution spread through Stormhaven like wildfire. Inmates began banging on their cells, creating a rhythmic protest that echoed through the ancient walls. But in cell 342, Kaz remained as serene as ever, his prayers now carrying a note of something that sounded almost like anticipation. Father Drake, making his way to Kaz's cell after hearing the news, was struck by a sudden realization. The light, the evidence, the rushed execution, everything was converging toward something momentous. As a man of faith, he had always believed in divine intervention, but now he was about to witness it firsthand. "Tomorrow night," he told Kaz through the bars, "will either be an ending or a beginning." Kaz's response sent chills down the priest's spine. "Every ending God writes is just another beginning in disguise, Father. And tomorrow night he's going to remind everyone in Stormhaven of that truth." The last dawn before Kaziah Everwind's execution painted Stormhaven Prison in shades of blood and gold. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like spectators assembling for a divine drama, their dark masses illuminated by occasional flashes of distant lightning. Inside cell block D, the atmosphere was charged with an energy that even the most skeptical guards couldn't deny. Detective Atlas Steele sat in his car outside the prison, gripping a folder of evidence so tightly his knuckles had turned white. After a sleepless night of investigation, he had uncovered a web of corruption that went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Regina Vale hadn't just been murdered, she had been silenced. As an investigative journalist, she had been close to exposing a network of powerful figures in Shadowvale Ridge, who had been orchestrating everything from real estate fraud to judicial bribes. The carpenter was the perfect scapegoat, Lysander Voss had explained in their latest meeting. A man known for letting strangers into his workshop late at night to help them. Who would question if one of those charitable acts had gone wrong? But time was running out. Every attempt Steele made to reach the governor's office was blocked. Every judge he contacted suddenly became unavailable. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected around Kaz's case, impenetrable to reason or justice. Inside Stormhaven, Officer Raven Thorne Aldrich began his shift with a heavy heart. As he walked the corridor to cell 342, he found himself remembering every conversation he'd had with Kaz over the months. Every moment of quiet wisdom that had slowly chipped away at his cynical worldview. "I've spent my life believing in what I can see and touch," Aldrich murmured, pausing outside Kaz's cell. "Concrete and steel, locks and keys. But now..." Kaz looked up from his prayers, a gentle smile crossing his face. "Now you're beginning to understand that the strongest walls aren't made of stone, Officer Aldrich. They're made of faith." The day unfolded with an almost ceremonial quality. Dr. Cassian Vale arrived to perform the final health check, a procedure that had never seemed more absurd to him than it did now. As he took Kaz's vitals, his scientific mind struggled to comprehend the readings before him. "Your body should be flooding with stress hormones," Vale muttered, checking his instruments for the third time. "Your heart rate should be elevated, blood pressure through the roof. Instead, you're as calm as someone about to take a peaceful nap." Kaz's response was typical of his quiet wisdom. "Perhaps, Doctor, peace isn't the absence of danger, but the presence of something greater than fear." Father Sylvestris Drake spent most of the day in Kaz's cell, ostensibly providing spiritual counsel but finding himself more often sitting in contemplative silence. The elderly chaplain had witnessed many last days, but none like this. Instead of the usual atmosphere of despair, Kaz's cell seemed filled with an almost tangible sense of anticipation. "I've been thinking about that light we saw," Drake said softly, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. "In all my years of ministry, I've never experienced anything like it." "The light was just a glimpse, Father," Kaz replied, his voice carrying a note of certainty that sent chills down Drake's spine. "Tonight, God will reveal himself in a way that no one in Stormhaven will ever forget." Meanwhile, Director Callius Droverson paced his office like a caged animal. Phone calls kept coming in from higher up the chain of command, each one more urgent than the last. The message was clear. Kaziah Everwind had to die tonight before certain truths came to light. "I don't care about protocol," he barked into his phone. "I don't care about proper procedures. That man does not see another sunrise, understood?" But even as he spoke these words, Droverson couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The air in Stormhaven felt different, charged with something he couldn't explain. The lights in his office had been flickering all day, and even the most hardened guards were reporting strange phenomena, unexplained sounds, unusual patterns of light, and a pervasive feeling that they were all standing on the brink of something momentous. As evening approached, the storm clouds that had been gathering all day began to converge over Stormhaven. The wind picked up, causing the old prison to creak and groan like a living thing. Inmates throughout death row had fallen unusually quiet, many of them praying, some for the first time in their lives. Detective Steele made one last desperate attempt to halt the execution, rushing to the prison with his evidence. But as he arrived at the gates, a tire blew out on his car, sending him spinning into a guardrail. As he fought to maintain consciousness, he could see the manila envelope containing all his evidence being caught by the wind, its contents scattered to the storm. Inside cell 342, Kaz spent his final hours in deep prayer. But unlike most condemned men's desperate pleas for mercy, his prayers were different, filled with gratitude, acceptance, and an unshakable certainty that transcended mere hope. "The time is coming," he told Father Drake, as the first drops of rain began to hit the window of his cell. "God's truth, like light, cannot be contained forever. Tonight, these walls will witness something that will shake the very foundations of doubt itself." As the storm intensified and the hour of execution approached, no one in Stormhaven Prison could have predicted just how literal those words would prove to be. As midnight approached Stormhaven Prison, the storm that had been building all day reached a terrifying intensity. Lightning split the sky in savage forks, illuminating the Gothic architecture of the prison in stark, ethereal bursts. The wind howled through the ancient corridors like a chorus of lost souls, and the rain hammered against the stone walls with an almost supernatural fury. In the prison infirmary, Detective Atlas Steele was being treated for minor injuries from his car accident. His head throbbed, but what pained him more was the knowledge that the evidence he'd gathered, evidence that could have saved an innocent man, was now scattered to the winds. As Dr. Cassian Vale bandaged a cut on his forehead, Steele couldn't keep the anguish from his voice. "You don't understand," he told the prison doctor. "Everything was in that folder. Proof of corruption, witness statements, photographs. Without it, there's no stopping this execution." Dr. Vale's hands paused in their work. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "there are other forces at work tonight. I'm a man of science, detective, but what I've witnessed in the past 24 hours defies all rational explanation." Meanwhile, in the execution preparation room, Officer Raven Thorne Aldrich supervised as the electric chair was tested one final time. Each time the switch was thrown, the lights throughout Stormhaven flickered ominously. But something was different about these power fluctuations. They seemed to pulse with an almost rhythmic quality, as if the electricity itself was responding to some higher frequency. "Run the test again," Director Kallius Droverson commanded, his voice betraying a nervousness that his rigid posture couldn't hide. When the switch was thrown this time, all the lights in the room flared with unusual brightness before dimming to an eerie glow. The technician shook his head in confusion. "I've never seen anything like this, sir. It's as if the electrical system has a mind of its own." In cell 342, Kaziah Everwind knelt in his final hour of prayer, but the peace that radiated from him had taken on an almost luminous quality. Father Sylvestris Drake, who had refused to leave his side, found himself reminded of ancient accounts of martyrs whose faith transformed their very presence. "Kaz," the priest said softly, "what you told me earlier about God revealing himself tonight, what did you mean?" Kaz opened his eyes, and in the storm's lightning flashes, they seemed to hold a light of their own. "Faith isn't just believing, Father. It's knowing. And tonight, everyone in Stormhaven will know the power of divine truth." The corridors of Death Row had fallen into an unprecedented silence. Hardened criminals pressed themselves against their bars, eyes fixed on cell 342, where many swore they could see a faint luminescence growing stronger by the minute. The air itself seemed charged with expectation, as if the very molecules were arranging themselves in preparation for something extraordinary. At precisely 11:45 p.m., the execution team arrived at Kaz's cell. Officer Aldrich, who had specifically requested to be part of the team, found his hands shaking as he unlocked the door. "It's time," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. Kaz rose with fluid grace, his chains making no sound, a detail that several witnesses would later recall with wonder. As they began the long walk to the execution chamber, something strange began to happen. Every light they passed would brighten momentarily, as if responding to Kaz's presence. The storm outside intensified, its thunder now carrying notes that sounded almost like distant music. Director Droverson, waiting in the execution chamber, felt his nerve begin to waver as he watched the procession approach on the security monitors. The image kept distorting, bands of light moving across the screen in patterns that the technical team couldn't explain. In the infirmary, Detective Steele suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide. Through the window he could see something extraordinary. Scraps of paper from his scattered evidence folder were being blown back toward the prison by the wind, some plastering themselves against the windows like silent accusations. Father Drake walked beside Kaz, murmuring prayers, but he found himself stumbling over the familiar words. There was something building in the air, a pressure that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the man walking serenely toward his appointed end. As they entered the final corridor leading to the execution chamber, every light in Stormhaven began to pulse in unison. The backup generators kicked in automatically, but instead of stabilizing the power, they added to the growing electromagnetic chaos. Computers throughout the prison began to malfunction. Security systems flickered between locked and unlocked, and the air itself seemed to crackle with visible energy. "What's happening?" Droverson demanded, as the execution chamber's instruments began registering readings that should have been impossible. "Someone get this under control." But control, as everyone present was beginning to realize, had passed far beyond human hands. As midnight approached and Kaziah Everwind was led to the electric chair, the very foundations of Stormhaven Prison seemed to throb with supernatural energy. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, its lightning now constant enough to turn night into day. Officer Aldrich, his hands trembling, began the process of securing Kaz into the chair. But as he touched the restraints, he felt something that made him gasp. The metal was warm, almost hot, and seemed to be vibrating with a frequency he could feel in his bones. "My God," he whispered, stepping back. "What is this?" Kaz's voice, when he spoke, carried clearly despite the storm's fury. "This, Officer Aldrich, is what happens when divine truth can no longer be contained by human chains." The execution chamber of Stormhaven Prison had become the eye of a supernatural storm. As the ancient clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, the air itself seemed to pulse with visible energy. Kaziah Everwind sat in the electric chair, his expression serene despite the chaos unfolding around him. The metal restraints that bound his wrists and ankles had grown so hot that wisps of steam rose where they met his skin, yet he showed no sign of discomfort. Director Callias Droverson stood by the control panel, his face illuminated by the strange rhythmic pulsing of the lights. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he watched his carefully maintained world begin to unravel. The electrical systems throughout Stormhaven were behaving in ways that defied explanation. Readings spiked and plummeted. Circuits that should have been isolated somehow responded in synchronization. "Sir," the chief technician called out, his voice tight with tension. "These readings. They're impossible. The power grid shouldn't be able to do this." Officer Raventhorn Aldrich, standing at his designated position, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The air around Kaz had taken on a quality he couldn't describe, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but somehow more substantial, more purposeful. The veteran guard found himself remembering every conversation he'd had with the condemned man, every moment that had slowly transformed his skepticism into something approaching faith. Father Sylvestris Drake, who had insisted on remaining present despite protocol, clutched his rosary so tightly the beads cut into his palm. The elderly priest had witnessed many executions in his years of service, but nothing like this. The very atmosphere seemed charged with divine presence, reminiscent of biblical accounts he had read, but never quite believed until now. "The Lord is my shepherd," Kaz began to pray, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm's fury. But these weren't the desperate prayers of a condemned man. They were spoken with the certainty of someone who knew their words were being heard. As he prayed, something extraordinary began to happen. The light fixtures throughout the chamber started to emit a blue-white glow that had nothing to do with their electrical components. This luminescence began to spread along the walls like living frost, following patterns that resembled ancient religious symbols. In the infirmary, Detective Atlas Steele watched in amazement as more pages from his scattered evidence folder began returning on the wind, plastering themselves against the windows. Through the streaks of rain, he could make out fragments of damning testimony, photographs that proved conspiracy, documents that showed the depth of corruption. Dr. Cassian Vale, who had been checking Steele's vital signs, stood transfixed by the impossible sight. "How?" Vale whispered, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The wind patterns would have to be defying multiple laws of physics. Back in the execution chamber, Director Droverson finally gathered his nerve. "Proceed with the execution," he commanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Now." The technician reached for the switch, but as his hand approached it, a bolt of lightning struck so close to the prison that the thunder was instantaneous. The impact shook the entire building, and in that moment, every electronic device in Stormhaven, from the simplest light bulb to the most sophisticated security system, surged with impossible power. The execution chamber was suddenly filled with a light so bright that everyone present had to shield their eyes. But Kaz kept his open, his face transformed by an expression of pure joy. The metal restraints that held him began to vibrate at a frequency that made them emit a high, clear tone, like crystal singing glasses played by an ethereal hand. "The time has come," Kaz said, his voice somehow carrying over the storm and the humming metal. "Watch and remember this moment, for God is about to reveal His truth." Officer Aldrich, squinting against the overwhelming light, saw something that would haunt his dreams forever after. The air around Kaz began to take on substance and form, like light becoming solid. The electric chair itself seemed to be transforming, its harsh angles softening in the incredible radiance. Director Droverson, in a last desperate attempt to maintain control, lunged for the execution switch himself. But as his hand closed around it, a surge of power unlike anything ever recorded in Stormhaven's history coursed through the building. The lights flared with blinding intensity, and then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, everything went dark. In the absolute blackness that followed, something impossible happened. Witnesses would later struggle to describe it. Some spoke of music that felt more than heard, others of light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But all agreed on one thing. In that moment, they felt the presence of something far beyond human understanding. When emergency power finally flickered on seconds later, the scene in the execution chamber defied explanation. The electric chair, that instrument of death that had ended so many lives, stood empty. The restraints lay open, showing no signs of being forced or broken. And Kaziah Everwind, the man whose faith had never wavered, stood in the center of the room completely free, surrounded by a fading aura of light that made him appear almost translucent. "God's truth," he said softly, looking at each stunned face in turn, "cannot be bound by human chains or human justice." The silence that fell over Stormhaven Prison in the wake of the miracle was profound enough to make even breathing seem intrusive. The execution chamber, still bathed in the fading ethereal light that surrounded Kaziah Everwind, had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the boundary between the earthly and divine had momentarily dissolved. Director Kaziah Droverson was the first to break the silence, his voice barely a whisper. This is impossible." The man who had commanded Stormhaven with an iron fist for 2 decades now stood trembling, his face ashen. The control panel before him, still smoking slightly from the power surge, displayed readings that would baffle electrical engineers for years to come. Officer Raventhorn Aldrich had fallen to his knees, tears streaming down his face. In his 12 years as a prison guard, he had built walls around his heart as solid as those that surrounded Stormhaven. But now those walls, like his certainty about the nature of reality, had crumbled completely. "I saw it," he kept whispering. "God help me. I saw it all." Father Sylvestris Drake moved slowly toward Kaz, his aged hands trembling as he reached out to touch the man he had counseled through so many dark nights. The priest had spent his life preaching about miracles, but experiencing one firsthand had transformed his academic faith into unshakable certainty. "In all my years of ministry," Drake said, his voice thick with emotion, we speak of God's power, but to witness it so directly." Kaz's response was characteristic of his quiet wisdom. "Faith, Father, isn't about waiting for miracles. It's about recognizing that every breath we take is already miraculous. What happened here tonight was simply God making visible what has always been true." The commotion had drawn others to the execution chamber. Dr. Cassian Vale arrived with Detective Atlas Steele, both men stopping dead in their tracks at the threshold. The prison doctor's scientific mind struggled to process what his eyes were telling him, while Steele noticed something that made his heart race. The scattered papers from his evidence folder had somehow found their way into the chamber, arranging themselves in a perfect pile on the control panel. "The truth," Kaz said, noting Steele's gaze, "has a way of coming to light, Detective. Sometimes it just needs a little divine intervention." As if in response to his words, the main lights of Stormhaven suddenly flickered back to life, revealing the full scene to everyone present. The electric chair, that instrument of death that had claimed so many lives, now stood transformed. Where there had been harsh metal and cruel restraints, the surface now bore patterns that looked like intricate religious symbols, etched by the same power that had set Kaz free. News of what had happened spread through Stormhaven like wildfire. In Cell Block D, hardened criminals fell to their knees in prayer. Guards who had witnessed even a fraction of the event found themselves questioning everything they had ever believed. The very air seemed charged with lingering divine energy. Director Droverson, still struggling to maintain some semblance of control, reached for his phone to call his superiors. But before he could dial, Detective Steele stepped forward, the recovered evidence in his hands. "I wouldn't make that call just yet, Director," Steele said, his voice firm. "I think we need to discuss the real reason Kaziah Everwind was sentenced to death." The color drained from Droverson's face as he saw the documents, proof of corruption, conspiracy, and murder, all pointing to those who had orchestrated this miscarriage of justice. But it was Kaz's next words that truly shook him. "I forgive you," Kaz said simply, looking at the prison director with compassion. "All of you who played a part in this. That's what tonight was about, not just proving innocence, but showing that divine love is stronger than human hatred." The storm outside had begun to calm, its fury spent in that momentous display of supernatural power. Through the high windows of the execution chamber, the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky in gentle hues of pink and gold. The night of miracles was ending, but its impact was only beginning to unfold. Officer Aldrich, finally finding his voice, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What happens now?" "Now," Kaz replied, the ethereal light around him finally fading completely. "The real work begins. A miracle isn't just a moment of divine intervention. It's a call to transformation. Each of you has witnessed something that defies human explanation. The question is, how will it change you?" As the sun rose over Stormhaven Prison, its light seemed different somehow, clearer, more purposeful. The ancient walls that had witnessed so much darkness had now become the setting for a story of divine intervention that would be told and retold for generations to come. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, the miracle wasn't just about one man's supernatural deliverance from death. It was about the moment when the veil between heaven and earth had thinned, and human certainties had given way to divine possibilities. It was about the night when faith became sight, and truth proved stronger than the chains of human justice. The dawn that broke over Shadowvale Ridge brought with it more than just a new day. As news of what had happened at Stormhaven Prison began to spread, the small coastal town found itself at the center of a story that would challenge the boundaries between faith and reason, justice and mercy, darkness and light. Detective Atlas Steele stood in the prison's administrative office, spreading out the miraculously recovered evidence across Director Droverson's desk. The papers that had been scattered to the winds had not only returned, they had arranged themselves in perfect chronological order, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy against Kaziah Everwind. "It goes all the way to the top," Steele explained to the assembled group, which included Father Drake, Officer Aldrich, and Dr. Vale. Regina Vale was investigating corruption in the town council, the courts, even the prison system itself. When she got too close, they silenced her and found the perfect scapegoat in Kaz. Lysander Voss, who had been brought to the prison to provide his testimony, nodded gravely. "She came to me that night, showed me documents proving that half the town's leadership was involved in everything from money laundering to judicial bribes. I was too afraid to speak up then. But after what I've witnessed today..." He glanced at Kaz, who stood quietly by the window, still emanating a subtle but unmistakable aura of peace. Some things are more powerful than fear. Director Droverson, his usual authority shattered by the night's events, sat heavily in his chair. "I was just following orders," he whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I never questioned, never wanted to know." "That's how darkness persists," Kaz said softly, turning from the window. "Not through the actions of evil men, but through the silence of good men who choose not to see." The morning light caught his face, and for a moment, those present were reminded of the supernatural radiance that had surrounded him during his miraculous deliverance. Word of what had happened spread rapidly beyond Stormhaven's walls. News vans began arriving at the prison gates, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like modern standing stones. Reporters gathered, drawn by rumors of impossibilities, stories of divine light, of restraints that opened themselves, of evidence that defied the wind to reveal the truth. But it was the changes taking place within Stormhaven that truly marked the miracle's impact. In Cell Block D, hardened criminals who had witnessed even a fraction of the previous night's events were transformed. Men who hadn't prayed in decades found themselves drawn to the prison chapel. Guards who had always seen their work as just a job began to look at their charges with new eyes. Officer Aldrich, making his rounds, found himself stopping at each cell, really seeing the inmates for perhaps the first time. "It's strange," he told Father Drake as they walked together. "I've worked these corridors for years, but it's like I'm seeing everything differently now. These men, they're not just numbers anymore." The priest nodded, understanding. "That's what real miracles do, Officer Aldrich. They don't just change circumstances, they change hearts. They open our eyes to what was always there but we couldn't, or wouldn't, see." Dr. Cassian Vale, meanwhile, had sequestered himself in the infirmary, poring over medical readings and electrical data from the night before. As a man of science, he felt compelled to understand, to quantify, to explain. But the numbers before him told a story that defied all natural laws. The energy readings during the event, he explained to anyone who would listen, they weren't just unusual, they were impossible. The human body can't generate that kind of electromagnetic field, and the patterns in the data, they're not random. It's like there was an intelligence behind it, a purpose to every fluctuation. As morning turned to afternoon, more evidence of corruption came to light. Detective Steele's phone rang constantly as more witnesses came forward, emboldened by what had happened at Stormhaven. The wall of silence that had protected the guilty for so long was crumbling, just as surely as the prison's electrical systems had been overwhelmed by divine power. But perhaps the most profound transformation was happening in the heart of Shadowvale Ridge itself. The town that had been so quick to condemn an innocent man was now being forced to confront its own darkness. People gathered in churches, in homes, and cafes, sharing their stories of how they had known something was wrong but had remained silent. Kaz's mother, Vesper Everwind, arrived at the prison with Acacia, his sister. Their reunion in the prison's visiting room was witnessed by many, who spoke later of how the air itself seemed to shimmer with joy as family bonds, strained by injustice but never broken, were restored. "My son," Vesper said, her aged hands framing Kaz's face. "I never lost faith. Not for a moment." "I know, Mother," Kaz replied, holding her close. "Your prayers were part of the miracle too." As the day progressed, more official vehicles began arriving at Stormhaven. State police, FBI agents, Justice Department officials. The evidence that had so miraculously reassembled itself was now setting in motion wheels of justice that no amount of corruption could stop. But for those who had witnessed the events of the previous night, these earthly proceedings, while important, seemed almost secondary. They had seen something that transcended human justice, something that would mark them forever. The week following the miracle at Stormhaven Prison transformed Shadowvale Ridge in ways that no one could have predicted. As federal investigators descended upon the small coastal town, the web of corruption that had nearly claimed Kaziah Everwind's life began to unravel with remarkable speed. But beneath the surface of these earthly proceedings, a deeper transformation was taking place, one that touched the souls of all who had witnessed divine intervention. Director Kallias Droverson, once the embodiment of institutional power, sat in his office for what he knew would be the last time. Before him lay his resignation letter, but his hands trembled as he reached for the pen. Officer Raven Thorn Aldrich stood quietly by the door, witnessing the fall of a man he had once feared and respected. "I've been running this prison for 20 years, Droverson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thought I knew everything there was to know about power and control, but last night..." He looked up at Aldrich, his eyes haunted. "What we saw in that execution chamber, that was real power, wasn't it?" Aldrich nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. And maybe that's what we were meant to learn. That there are forces greater than our systems, our rules, our certainties." The electric chair, still bearing its inexplicable transformations, had become something of a shrine. Dr. Cassian Vale had spent hours documenting the changes, the strange symbols etched into the metal, the residual energy readings that defied explanation. Scientists from various universities had arrived to study the phenomenon, but their instruments could only measure the after effects of divine intervention. "The patterns in the metal," Dr. Vale explained to a colleague, running his fingers over the transformed surface. "They're not random. They appear to be ancient religious symbols, some of which haven't been seen in centuries. But here's the extraordinary thing. They're still warm to the touch, still emanating energy readings that shouldn't be possible." Father Sylvestris Drake had taken to spending long hours in the prison chapel, which was now constantly full. Inmates who had never shown any interest in spiritual matters sought him out, hungry to understand what they had witnessed. The elderly priest found himself sharing not theological doctrine, but rather the simple truth of what he had seen. "Faith," he told them, "isn't about understanding everything. It's about recognizing that some things transcend understanding." What happened in that execution chamber wasn't just about saving one man's life. It was about showing us that divine reality is closer than we think. Detective Atlas Steele, working with federal authorities, watched as the corruption he had fought so hard to expose was finally brought to light. One by one, the powerful figures who had orchestrated Regina Vale's murder and Kaz's false conviction were arrested. But what struck him most was how many of them broke down and confessed, as if the miracle at Stormhaven had shattered not just their conspiracy, but their ability to hide from the truth. "It's like dominoes falling," he told Lysander Voss, who had become a key witness in the federal investigation. "But it's more than just fear of prosecution. These people, it's like they can't bear the weight of their secrets anymore." Voss nodded, understanding. "When you've seen what we saw, actual divine intervention, it changes how you view everything. The lies we tell ourselves, the darkness we try to hide. It all seems so pointless in the face of that light." Throughout Cell Block D, the atmosphere had changed completely. The usual tension and hostility had been replaced by something almost like reverence. Inmates gathered in small groups, sharing their experiences of that night, each account adding to the larger tapestry of miracle. One inmate, a lifer named Marcus who had witnessed everything from his cell, expressed what many were feeling. "All these years I thought these walls defined what was possible. Thought I knew the limits of reality. But now I know that no wall is strong enough to contain God's truth." Kaziah Everwind, though officially cleared of all charges, continued to visit Stormhaven regularly. His presence brought a palpable sense of peace to the prison, and both guards and inmates found themselves drawn to him, seeking understanding of what they had witnessed. "The miracle wasn't just about proving my innocence," he would tell them. "It was about proving that divine love is real, that it can break any chain, penetrate any darkness. Each of you who witnessed it has been given a gift, not just a story to tell, but a truth to live by." The transformed electric chair had become a symbol of something larger than just one man's deliverance. Visitors to Stormhaven would stand before it in silence, many reaching out to touch the mysteriously altered metal, feeling the lingering warmth that defied physical laws. Scientists might struggle to explain it, skeptics might try to dismiss it, but for those who had been there, the truth was undeniable. "Sometimes," Kaz told a group of inmates gathered in the prison yard, God has to shake our foundations to help us build something new. What happened here wasn't just about saving one life. It was about showing us all that there's more to reality than what we can see or touch or prove. 1 month after the miracle at Stormhaven Prison, Shadowvale Ridge had become a place of pilgrimage. People came from across the country, drawn by stories of the night when divine power had manifested in an execution chamber. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, the true miracle wasn't just what they had seen. It was how it had transformed their lives. Officer Raven Thorne Aldrich stood at the entrance to cell 342, which had been preserved exactly as it was the night of the miracle. The walls still bore a faint luminescence that no amount of repainting could cover, and visitors often reported feeling a profound sense of peace upon entering the space. "I used to think my job was about containing people," Aldrich told a group of new guards during their orientation. "Now I understand it's about seeing them, really seeing them. What happened in this cell taught me that every human being, no matter their past, carries a spark of the divine." The former director Droverson had pleaded guilty to all charges, but his testimony during the federal investigation surprised everyone. Instead of trying to minimize his role, he spoke with a raw honesty that moved even the most hardened investigators. "I saw something that night that shattered everything I believed about power and control," he told the court. "When divine light filled that execution chamber, it didn't just expose our corruption. It exposed the poverty of our entire worldview. How can you go back to wielding human authority once you've witnessed true divine power?" Dr. Cassian Vale had published his findings in several scientific journals, knowing they would likely damage his professional reputation. The energy readings, the unexplainable transformations, the lingering electromagnetic anomalies, none of it fit within accepted scientific parameters. But as he explained to his colleagues, some truths were worth the cost of ridicule. "What we witnessed that night forces us to expand our understanding of reality," he argued during a controversial lecture at a prestigious university. "The measurements we took, the physical changes we documented, they suggest that what we call miraculous might simply be a higher order of natural law, one that responds to spiritual rather than physical principles." Father Sylvestris Drake had seen his small prison chapel transform into a center of spiritual renewal. The pews were constantly full, not just with inmates and guards, but with visitors seeking to understand what had happened. The elderly priest found himself sharing a message that transcended traditional religious boundaries. "The miracle we witnessed wasn't just about one man's deliverance," he would say. "It was about God removing the veil between the visible and invisible worlds, showing us that faith isn't blind belief. It's recognizing a reality that's always present, just waiting to break through." Detective Atlas Steele had undergone perhaps the most profound personal transformation. The cynical investigator who had once trusted only in evidence and procedure now found himself approaching cases with a different perspective. The federal investigation he led had uncovered corruption far beyond Shadowvale Ridge, but it was his testimony about the night of the miracle that carried the most weight in court. "I saw papers scattered by the wind return against all physical laws," he testified. "I watched evidence reassemble itself in perfect order. But more than that, I witnessed something that changed how I understand justice itself. Sometimes truth needs more than human systems to come to light." Lysander Voss, whose testimony had helped expose the conspiracy, had started a support group for others struggling with the weight of secrets. "Witnessing a miracle doesn't free you from responsibility," he would tell them. "It challenges you to live up to the truth you've seen." But it was in Cell Block D that the most profound changes were visible. The section of the prison that had once been known for its hopelessness had become a place of transformation. Inmates who had witnessed the miracle began mentoring newer prisoners, sharing not just their experience of that night, but the hope it had awakened in them. Kaziah Everwind, though free to leave Shadowvale Ridge, chose to stay. He established a ministry that worked with both inmates and their families, helping them navigate the justice system while maintaining their faith. His workshop, once the scene of a tragic murder, had been converted into a sanctuary where ex-offenders could learn carpentry skills while rebuilding their lives. "Every piece of wood has a story to tell," he would say as he taught them his craft. "Just like every human life has purpose and potential, waiting to be revealed. Sometimes it takes a divine touch to show us what's possible. The electric chair, still bearing its mysterious transformations, had been moved to a special room in Stormhaven. It stood as a testament to the night when divine power had overwhelmed human justice, its altered surface still warm to the touch, still emanating energy that defied scientific explanation. But more than a relic, it had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that no situation was beyond the reach of divine intervention. "Look closely at the patterns," Kaz would tell visitors, running his fingers over the transformed metal. "They tell a story not just about one night of miracle, but about the constant possibility of transformation. Every symbol etched here speaks of divine love breaking through human darkness." 1 year after the miracle at Stormhaven Prison, Shadowvale Ridge had become known as a place where heaven and earth had briefly touched. The story of Kaziah Everwind's divine deliverance had spread far beyond the small coastal town, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, the true miracle wasn't just what had happened that night. It was what continued to happen in its wake. The old execution chamber had been permanently sealed and converted into a memorial chapel. The transformed electric chair stood at its center, its mysteriously altered surface still warm to the touch, still bearing the inexplicable symbols that scientists had failed to fully explain. Dr. Cassian Vale's final report on the phenomenon had become required reading in theological seminaries and physics departments alike. "Some mysteries," Dr. Vale wrote, "are not meant to be solved, but to solve us. What happened that night forces us to confront the limitations of our understanding and opens us to greater possibilities." Officer Raventhorn Aldrich had been promoted to head of rehabilitation at Stormhaven, implementing programs that focused on spiritual and emotional healing alongside traditional corrections. The hardened guard who had once believed only in locks and bars now spoke regularly about the night that had transformed his understanding of both justice and mercy. "We witnessed something that changed everything," he would tell new staff members. "Not just the miracle itself, but what it revealed about human potential for transformation. Every person who comes through these gates carries that same potential." Father Sylvestris Drake, though retired from his official duties, continued to serve as a spiritual advisor to both inmates and staff. The elderly priest had written a small book about his experience that had touched hearts around the world. Its simple title, "The Night Light Broke Through," had become a beacon of hope for those facing seemingly impossible situations. "Divine intervention," he would often say, "isn't just about dramatic moments of miracle. It's about recognizing that the same power that broke those chains is available every day, working in quieter ways to transform lives." Detective Atlas Steele had gone on to establish a special unit dedicated to reviewing questionable convictions. The cynical investigator who had once trusted only in physical evidence now approached each case with a deeper understanding of justice. "What happened at Stormhaven taught me that truth has its own power," he explained. "Sometimes it needs human hands to help it along, but ultimately, it finds its way into the light." The corruption that had nearly cost Kaz his life had been fully exposed, leading to reforms throughout the criminal justice system. Lysander Voss's testimony had helped convict dozens of officials, but more importantly, it had inspired others to come forward with their own truths. But it was Kaziah Everwind himself who embodied the most profound transformation. The man who had faced death with unshakable faith now led a ministry that touched thousands of lives. His workshop, once the scene of tragedy, had become a place of healing and hope. "The miracle wasn't just about saving my life," Kaz would tell those who came to hear his story. "It was about showing us that divine love is real, that it can break any chain, penetrate any darkness. Each of us carries that potential for miracle within us, not just to receive divine intervention, but to be divine intervention for others." The town of Shadowvale Ridge itself had been transformed. Where there had once been corruption and silence, there was now a community dedicated to truth and justice. The cliffs where Kaz had once prayed alone were now visited by pilgrims seeking their own encounters with the divine. In Cell Block D, inmates still spoke of the night when light had filled their cells and hope had become tangible. Many of them had undergone profound transformations, their lives testament to the ongoing power of what they had witnessed. Some people ask if it really happened, one inmate reflected. They want proof, explanations. But when you've seen divine light break through prison walls, you don't need explanations anymore. You just need to live in the truth of what you've witnessed. The story of the miracle at Stormhaven continues to spread, touching lives and transforming hearts. It stands as a testament to the power of unwavering faith, the reality of divine intervention, and the truth that no situation is beyond the reach of divine love. For those who were there that night, the guard whose cynicism melted in divine light, the priest whose faith became sight, the doctor whose science embraced mystery, the detective whose pursuit of justice led to truth, and the man whose unshakable faith moved heaven itself. The miracle never really ended. It lives on in transformed lives, in renewed hope, in unshakable faith that even in the darkest places, divine light can break through. And perhaps that ongoing transformation is the greatest miracle of all. Remember to like and subscribe to hear more incredible stories of faith, miracles, and divine intervention. Your support helps us share these powerful testimonies with the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.